Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be back here at SFU on another Tuesday night. I think some of us were here last Tuesday night for a discussion on restorative justice, and it's wonderful to be back in this space. And I am always enormously impressed with the work of Simon Fraser University in extending the work of dialogue within our community to help make our community a safe and hospitable place to live. And to do that here at the Woodwards Complex is really quite extraordinary. So my compliments to SFU, and it's a great privilege to be with you tonight. Just invite you to take a deep breath from whatever the day has taken you today. If you're like me, a quick supper before this after a long day, and just prepare ourselves to be here with each other and present in this important work of interreligious, interfaith dialogue. I'm a great believer and supporter of the work of dialogue in so many sectors, particularly amongst the religions, and see it as an important ongoing project, not just an occasional foray. And the reason I say that is because it's usually, and then sadly and too late, not until religious building, a church, a mosque, a synagogue, a temple, has been defaced or in some ways violated in our community, that then the call goes out for greater understanding and learning about our neighbors from the variety of faith traditions that Vancouver has. The reason I support and am particularly excited to be here tonight is every opportunity to be with brothers and sisters from other faith traditions gives us yet another unprecedented opportunity to learn, to be informed, to grow, to see the world through another's eyes. So to tonight, we have a most distinguished panel who will be responding to Daniel Tutt's address. Maharuna Ghani, Ali Lakhani, Simi Gaza, Paula Carr, and Robert Delm. And I will introduce each of them after our opening address tonight. But it's my task and privilege to introduce to you Daniel Tutt. Daniel Tutt's work focuses on creating dialogue and action around persisting problems between Muslims and American mainstream culture. He has directed 20,000 Dialogues, a project of Unity Productions Foundation that uses film and dialogue to bring different affinity groups together for transformative dialogue on Islam in America. Currently, he is a fellow at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, a nonpartisan think tank that seeks to provide commentary and analysis on issues relating to Islam and Muslims. He serves as an advisor for social justice organizations such as the 9/11 Unity Walk and Religious Freedom USA. He's a doctoral student at the European Graduate School in Switzerland in media philosophy, and I think he spent about 7 hours today walking around Vancouver. Welcome, Daniel Tutt.
Thank you, Pastor, for that very warm introduction, and thank you all for being here tonight. Special thanks to Am Johal here, who really, I think, is the backbone of tonight's event and all the wonderful programming that happens here in this room. So if we could get a round of applause for Am. So I want to start and really lay what I hope will be both a practical and a bit of a theoretical, but I promise not too academic, overview of this problem that we're here gathered to better understand. And so allow me to jump in by a bit of setting up of the term itself, because one of the things I was on the CBC radio earlier this afternoon, and in Canada, the term Islamophobia is quite interesting because there's not a general use in everyday life of the term. It's not exchanged, I think, as much as it is in the States. And if we look historically, it is a new term. It was actually invented in a think tank report called the Runnymede Trust report in Great Britain in 1992. It has, since that time, taken on a number of different connotations and a wide array of meanings, leading some to argue that its use is exaggerated, that it's used as a ploy to censor what are otherwise real concerns about the radical threat that Islam poses to Western civilization. Others link the phenomenon to a much larger historical and cultural process that has emerged in recent years, which is much more like racism or xenophobia. That historically we could look at works like Orientalism by Edward Said that charts since the last 1400 years a long narrative of exclusionary discourses that Western popular literature has produced that have sought to objectify Muslims. So while the term itself is not entirely polarized between left and right discourses, it is problematic. It is absolutely a problematic term. But like any term that we use to understand a larger complex issue in society, I think we should still use it. So allow us to at least provisionally put this term into this dialogue and this discussion tonight so that we can help understand it. But the one problem that I do have with it is the word phobia. Phobia to me means that someone has a medicalized relationship to the problem. But in reality, even the third, according to public opinion poll, there's 1/3 of Westerners, both in Canada and the States and in Europe, that straight out admit that yes, I do have a prejudice towards Muslims. So that's one form, what I would call an extreme prejudice. But in reality, 63% of Westerners claim to have never met a Muslim, which and here I'm stereotyping, by the sheer look and composition of tonight's room, I see such diversity that this mere fact that such 60% of people claim to have never met a Muslim is a very interesting phenomenon. We saw the challenge of Islamophobia recently arise in an article in Foreign Policy magazine by an Egyptian public intellectual named Mona Al-Tahawi, and she wrote a very, very provocative piece called "Why Do They Hate Us?" I don't know if anybody read this. It got a lot of feedback on Twitter and social media, and it was about trying to create a real discussion on misogyny in the Muslim world. And one of the interesting things that happened was Western Muslim and secular academics who come from Muslim heritages felt that we cannot create this kind of real, deeper dialogue on a problem such as misogyny, in part because Islamophobia is so entrenched, and that Westerners don't have the nuance or the ability or the tools to even understand complex problems. So this is the level at which we're dealing with this struggle. So I want to start tonight's talk first understanding how Islamophobia is transmitted, how it's relayed, how it's circulated, and how it's spread in government. And then I want to look at a recent emergence of Islamophobia in civil society, in grassroots and citizen movements. And then I'll end with a little bit on the media. Nothing happens in a vacuum, and we have to put everything in a historical context and historical background. Islamophobia, according to many analysts, has actually gotten worse since 9/11. And we could do a historical genealogy going back 1,400 years, but I don't want to take that much time. I actually want to look more in the present. I want to look in the past 3 to 4 years to really understand what's going on right now. My other goal is to share some more practical strategies with you. I come from several organizational hats, one of which is Unity Productions Foundation, and we're seeking to create transformative narratives in the public media. We have done 9 different documentary films on PBS in the States, starting with a story on the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and lately we've done a new film that's actually going to come out in July on Islamic art. So all of our films and our dialogue programs and our work in Hollywood seeks to transform and challenge Americans to understand Muslims in a new way. So I want to share a little bit of that. So I'm coming at this with a spirit of inquiry. I'm coming at this with a spirit of tikkun olam, as we have a rabbi here. Tikkun olam is a wonderful Hebrew term which refers to us seeking to repair, to heal this divide, because ultimately this is a divide. To do this, I want to first understand how Islamophobia butts up and ultimately short circuits multiculturalism. The great Canadian political philosopher Charles Taylor said that if you look at every crisis of multiculturalism in recent times, the thing that caused the crisis most often has to do with Islam or the role of Muslims in Western society. Now, to better understand this phenomenon, I want to pull from the late French thinker and philosopher Michel Foucault. Michel Foucault, in his work on power and political subjectivity, presents a mode of governance, a concept that he refers to as governmentality. Governmentality is a concept that helps us to understand how the state administers public life and how that administration is externally linked to the knowledges and to the discourses that govern citizens outside the rubric and purview of the state. Governmentality not only governs citizens, but it shores up the legitimacy of the state, and in so doing, it expands state power. The primary features of governmentality include the harnessing of individual, communal, and international civic forces that might otherwise be anarchic or self-destructive. Why is governmentality relevant to this conversation? As Francis Fukuyama, the great neoconservative thinker, has written, we live in the end times. We live at the end of history. We live after the fall of the Cold War in a post-political world. What Wendy Brown has referred to as a thinning of civic life. So we lack the big ideological struggle to ground a lot of our civic life. So governmentality becomes a way for Foucault, as he shows, when the state can no longer promise universal representation, i.e. multiculturalism, when it can no longer pretend to be in a norm-free cultural standing, and when liberal values of assimilation, secularism, and formal equality are called into question as a basis of nation-state belonging, governmentality becomes that process that seeks to solve differences by subtracting from this loss of universal representation in order to resurrect the neutrality of the state. So how has this diminished ability of the state to manage cross-cultural differences impacted Islamophobia? I want to point to three examples. One from France, one from Quebec, and one from Europe more generally, and then one from the States. In 2005, the European Court of Human Rights affirmed the ban on Leyla Sahin's headscarf at a medical school in Istanbul, Turkey. The court declared that the ban against Sahin was a violation of her human rights, but they nonetheless affirmed the ban on the basis of pluralism, broad-mindedness, and tolerance. The court argued that in order to advance these values and protect democracy, it was legitimate to adopt the ban on the headscarf as a proportional means to advance such legitimate aims. Similarly, the legal decision to ban the headscarf across schools in France and Quebec more recently was justified in the name of liberal equality and a values-based approach. Here, the courts upheld the ban on the Islamic headscarf in France as a way to promote national integration of a shared secular identity. Again, this is how Foucault's concept of governmentality can help us here. This use of a shared secular identity language resembles Foucault's governmentality in the way that the liberal state served to defend society's rights, albeit promoting a brutal exclusion of what those rights actually represent. While we pride ourselves on a model of multicultural tolerance that is inclusive and broad, Western philosophers from Descartes to Rousseau, who are in part the chief developers of multiculturalism in the West, should also be read as developing a sense of universalism that is exclusive by its very nature, perhaps violently exclusive. The preconditions for participation in universal liberalism involves, by its very nature, the uprooting of the individual from their ethnic, cultural, or religious contexts for participation in the universal neutral sphere. In the United States, one of the more recent crisis points that reveals the extent of Islamophobic influence in government and law enforcement was the NYPD's spying on hundreds of thousands of Muslims along the East Coast, including students and young children. This was a wholesale wiretapping operation that was recently leaked by the Associated Press. In a very interesting Stanford Law Review article by Samuel Raskoff entitled "Establishing an Official Islam," Raskoff, an NYU professor, points out how the Obama administration's unique approach to collaboration with the Muslim community under the banner of countering violent extremism, well, there we go, that's better. And countering violent extremism is the new euphemism that Obama has used for counterterrorism. Raskoff argues that these efforts are actually seeking to put forward the U.S. government, through collaboration with Muslim American communities, to put forward, in many cases, a new definition of Islam in the public sphere. They do this by recruiting so-called moderate Muslims as agents of United States diplomatic efforts abroad in Muslim countries. They have government officials attend Islamic-related religious events and conferences. And Raskoff argues that the government is promoting a threat to the Establishment Clause of the U.S. Constitution, which sanctions the freedom of conscience for an individual to practice and to define their religion without any coercion or without any manipulation by an outside entity. Raskoff shows how State Department officials are going beyond merely serving and protecting American Muslim populations, but are actively seeking to redefine core terms in the Islamic vocabulary. John Brennan, one of the chief counterterrorism advisors to the U.S., recently noted that jihad does not refer to murdering innocent men and women and children, but rather it refers to a holy struggle, a legitimate struggle in Islam. Now, don't get me wrong, the ostensible efforts here of the U.S. government are to strengthen moderate Islam and help to portray a certain moderate strand of Islam as the correct and as the acceptable version. While many Muslims in the U.S. and the West more broadly participate in these efforts, it is also a mode of what Foucault would refer to as governmentality, in the sense that it perpetuates a sense of who's on the inside and who's on the outside. And it ultimately poses a threat to the religious freedom of American Muslims. Now, one thing that I would recommend, of course, you hear me say these things and you must think that I'm anti-moderate Islam and so on and so forth. No, not whatsoever. What I'm suggesting is that this is not a role for the U.S. government, or really for any government. This is a role for Muslims themselves, for Muslim NGOs, for mosques, for Muslim theologians, for Muslim religious leaders to be doing. They should be aided in proper ways, but they should not be co-opted in such a way. Now, President Bush was able to neutralize this extreme prejudice that we've seen resurface under Obama, in part through his rhetoric that called for tolerance and peaceful relations with Muslim Americans immediately following 9/11. Since Obama's election, the economic downturn and what I would refer to as the ethnic browning of America, we've seen several successful campaigns by a well-funded fringe group and cottage industry of Islamophobe writers, bloggers, and think tank representatives. The most high-profile event being, of course, the Ground Zero Mosque controversy, which was not a mosque and not at Ground Zero. It was actually a cultural center that was half a mile away from Ground Zero, but you know what happened. Now, this extreme right-wing group is seeking to peddle fear, and the way that they function was actually documented in a recent report by the Center for American Progress called Fear Incorporated, The Roots of the Islamophobia Network in America. And what they've shown is very, very interesting. We find, though, that despite their efforts, and we'll talk about them in a minute, despite their efforts, the Gallup organization has found that if you want to understand prejudice towards Muslims, you have to understand that it is not perpetuated by one single group. So the Gallup has actually found, when they do polls, fundamentalist Christians, Tea Party, conservative males over 40 who frequently attend religious events. Now these are the cohorts that express prejudice, sure. But guess what the single biggest predictor as to whether someone will hold prejudice towards Muslims is. The single biggest predictor is if they also hold prejudice towards Jews, which leads us to believe that the source of Islamophobia, while we do have this cottage industry happening here, is actually a much more generalized fear of otherness. There's a much more generalized xenophobia, if you will. So here, a historical analysis of how other outgroups have served this function in Western life would be very important. The Catholics, the Irish, the Japanese, the Chinese here in Vancouver have occupied this space of being the outgroup. Incidentally, there is a major opportunity for understanding Islamophobia in the United States because, of course, despite the fact that a lot of commentators are claiming that we live in a post-racial America, the largest demographic of American Muslims are African Americans, which they chart their legacy from 1492 when Christopher Columbus landed. Because what happened right before Columbus came? The Muslim empire in Spain had fallen. So no doubt there may have been some Muslims on the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. So, like I said, there is strong evidence for this upsurge in Islamophobia. The Southern Poverty Law Center, which has been tracking hate groups very, very meticulously for many years, has shown that in 2011, we've seen a rise in hate crimes at new levels towards Muslims. We've seen a rise in employment discrimination. We've seen the rise of a dozen new organizations that have at their very mission, at the core mission, to be anti-Muslim. Now, this is problematic in the sense that for those of us here gathered to understand, to promote dialogue, to promote peace, if you take one example, there's a group called Act for America. And you go to their website, you can start a chapter to combat the threat that radical Islam poses to the West. And they have 350 chapters, and they have a lot of energy, and they're very active, and they're doing way more events on this topic than all of us are. So there's something to look into. What motivates them? Why are they so successful? Now, there have been the persistence of several myths. Now, all of this stuff, of course, doesn't happen in a vacuum. Now, what are the core myths that fuels a lot of this Islamophobia? The first one is that President Obama is a Muslim. Now, this is laughable, but 15 to 30% in Mississippi, they recently found that just under half of the population actually believes that President Obama is a Muslim because in a portion of his life he lived in Indonesia and attended an Islamic school. Secondly, Sharia law poses a grave existential threat to America. Over 24 states in the United States have actually sought to ban preemptively. So they're not banning something that exists, they're preempting the possibility of it from happening. Mosques are Trojan horses that are secretly seeking to disseminate radicalism. Congressman Peter King, who's actually held several hearings on radical Islam, some people refer to him as the new McCarthy, has argued that 80% of mosques in America support radical activity and homegrown terrorism. Radical Islam has infiltrated America, the government, and mainstream Muslim organizations. A wholesale demonization of American Muslim organizations, their leaders, declaring that their distant allegiance to charitable activities in the 1990s, which touched groups like Hamas, should lead us to designate them as a terrorist organization. These are groups that have the largest followings of Muslims in the West, including Council on American Islamic Relations, the Islamic Society of North America. And this stereotype has led to basically the barring of Muslim participation in political life. Because they have, I'll give you a nice analogy. If we are done with World War II, it's the 1960s, and Germans are experiencing civil rights challenges in Canada, and a German civil rights group that has legitimate concerns about protecting German citizens from civil rights abuses were to start some work. And then they had an oppositional campaign that said, the Nazi-inspired German civil rights group. Now, we all know that they're not Nazi-inspired, but the connotation doesn't matter. If you put Hamas inspired next to the American Muslim Organization, by that very association, people don't need to do any analysis. It's already there. Another myth is that practicing Muslims cannot be loyal to Western states. They argue that there is something about Islam that is unlike other religions in that it seeks to allow believers to lie because they are at war with the infidel. So what they've done is they've taken a concept that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, developed during a just war, which is called taqiyya, which was if you are fighting an enemy and it is declared that it is the conditions you are eligible to fight, you can use deception to counter that enemy. Now, they've exploded that to make it part of the 5 pillars, which is totally asinine and totally out of step with what Islamic teaching is about. Certain conservative politicians revere these talking points because they offer an opportunity to throw a wedge issue into a political climate that is suffering from real problems, ongoing wars in Afghanistan, economic downturn. But these issues serve as a sort of a device to get people mobilized. Like I said, Act for America has 350 chapters. Their blood is boiling over with excitement. The argument that Sharia law poses the gravest threat to our national security was probably the most common myth that politicians incorporated into their advertisements, and in some cases it served as the core platform of their campaign. Stephen Harper, the Prime Minister of Canada, has also picked up on this fear-provoking discourse when he argued that the most serious threat to Canadian security is radical Islam. Now, one look at the fledgling Al-Qaeda will show that radical Islam is thankfully a relatively isolated phenomenon, which only a fraction of 1% of the 1.3 billion Muslims worldwide adhere to. It does present what analysts call a non-traditional data set. And analysts see this cohort and they become baffled. Most radicals are recruited to join radical Islamist causes out of political grievances, directly linked to foreign occupation. And most of them are recruited online, through online propaganda. There is very few to none propaganda happening in mosques or religious institutions. As a part of my own work, I conduct counter-radicalization and counterterrorism trainings at police and law enforcement and military installations. One of the things that they have pointed out to me is that they are concerned that this climate of Islamophobia might itself serve as a justification for a future attack. Thankfully, that has not happened yet, but it's something that we should be looking at. By all accounts, well over half the time a homegrown terrorism case occurs, it is the Muslim community that turns that individual over to the authorities. Indeed, mosques are not preaching violent radicalization, and very few Muslims are even ever exposed to radical propaganda. Despite this reality, the Islamophobia network is able to spread influence into mainstream culture via what the Center for American Progress calls cultural validators. These are prominent talk radio hosts, journalists, news anchors, and politicians. Now, I want to pull from a concept in philosophy that to help us understand this, and this was actually, I owe this to Martha Nussbaum in her new book called The New Religious Intolerance, which just came out. I highly recommend it. And she calls this the cascade effect. So the cascade effect refers to the way that influential personalities can generate and exude great influence over the population. I'll give you an example. Who's ever heard of the document called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion? Yeah. This was a document that was in late 19th century, and it was the primary device, propaganda device, that was used to spark this conspiracy that Jews had a desire to overturn the world economy. A, that they had the power to, which was laughable at best, and B, that this was the secret plot of Jews. And unfortunately, this is actually, for anti-Semitism work, this is still going on. But this functions by the cascade effect. It functions in this way. The myths that the Islamophobia network have managed to propagate are rooted in an exaggerated and paradoxical fear that an otherwise marginal and relatively weak culture, Muslims in the West, and when I say weak, I just mean in population. They make up 1% of the population in the US, I think under 2% in Canada, and the largest is 10% in Germany. But nonetheless, they argue that Muslims possess the ability to overthrow governments and that their intentions are hidden, that they lie, that they have secret agendas. This fear of a secret Muslim takeover of Western life runs throughout their entire discourse. And unfortunately, you know who picked up this was Anders Breivik. Anders Breivik, who murdered 69 innocent Norwegian youth, was one of the biggest consumers of their blogs. Muslims in the West, as I said, oh, sorry, here. No. Okay, now, this idea of Muslim allegiance is very an interesting one, because recently in Osama bin Laden's compound, they discovered some documents that he had apparently communicated with other al-Qaeda operatives. And he pointed out how he was concerned that the propaganda was not reaching American Muslims. Why? Because theologically, Muslims have a long-standing tradition of allegiance to a non-Muslim state. Even conservative theologians such as Ibn Taymiyyah, who was writing during the Mongol invasion of the 13th century, would write an argument that a Muslim should adhere to the law of the land, that that's a part of the Sharia. So even bin Laden knew that it would be difficult to promote this sense of a Muslim takeover. Now, how are these, as I'm saying some of these things, I would hope many of you are a bit baffled as to how this influence is able to exert the force that it does in mainstream life. I want to pull from another concept in philosophy, which is called the availability heuristic. Now, the availability heuristic is an unconscious process that operates on the notion that if you can think of it, it must be important. The availability heuristic is a mental shortcut that uses the ease with which examples come to the mind to make judgments about the probability of an event. The availability of consequences associated with an action is positively related to perceptions of the magnitude of the consequences of that action. In other words, the easier it is to recall the consequences of something, the bigger we perceive the consequences to be. Sometimes this heuristic is beneficial, but the frequency that events come to mind are usually not accurate reflections of their actual probability in reality. Faced as we are with such a lack of credible information about Islam, when we are presented with so-called facts that are put in compelling emotional terms in fear-based language, bias emerges. The best example of this is the argument that they made that if they can build a church, if they won't build a church in Mecca, why would we let them build a mosque at ground zero? Right? Now this was an email that my mom received, and she forwarded it to me. She said, Daniel, why is this happening? Why won't they build a church in Mecca? No, seriously. And I said, Mom, why won't they build a mosque in the Vatican? It's sacred ground. I mean, but it's literally sacred ground, right? So it's a very interesting thing. Now, so if we look at the most extensive public opinion poll of Muslim West attitudes ever done globally by the Gallup organization, we find that a large majority of Americans, 65%, believe that the U.S. citizenry is prejudiced towards Muslims. So that's Americans admitting that we are, 65%, okay? Some have argued, including the Harvard sociologist Robert Putnam, that the best way to understand this prejudice is through what he calls contact theory. Contact theory is the idea that the most significant way to break a prejudice about a people is to come into contact with them, to come to an event like you are here tonight, to build a relationship. Putnam eloquently refers to this theory in a different name in his latest book called American Grace. He refers to it as the bridging model, or coming into contact and forming a relationship, a civic friendship, with a Muslim or a religious other that can lead to an increase of understanding about that entire culture. Well, USA Today has reported in 2011, at the height of the Ground Zero Mosque controversy, that 63% of Americans claim to have never met a Muslim, Gallup has shown that even those Americans who do know a Muslim personally do not necessarily tend to have a more positive view of the entire religion. It's very interesting. The Pew Forum just did a survey of millennials, which is our generation, younger people, and what they found was that large majorities believe that Muslims living in the West should have equal rights, citizenship, etc. But also large majorities held negative views of the religion of Islam. So what we're seeing is a very interesting trend emerge, which is basically you can stay here and practice your religion, but I don't like it. Yeah? So this poses a challenge. This poses a challenge on the level of religious respect, of religious imagination, and what it requires to get at some of this. So, both the West and the Muslim world recognize that the other side misrecognizes the other side, which is a positive sign, because the first step to solving any problem is admittance. Muslims outside of the West admit that they do not know about the lives of Muslims living in the West, but they say that it is very important to them that Muslims living in the West are treated well. Perhaps one of the biggest challenges that we face in repairing this divide is this very trend that I just pointed out. For example, 53% of Americans who say they hold no prejudice towards Muslims say they know someone who practices Islam. Comparatively, 44% of those who say they have a great deal of prejudice towards Muslims say the same thing. So in other words, this is the new challenge of Islamophobia, which is we may be able to fit into the multicultural sphere of the neutral governmentality I was talking to before, but we are lacking a respect for the religion. Much of these perceptions I have shared lead me to the question of how we can understand and transform Islamophobia into mutual understanding and respect. I have opened with a broader context of how the government and liberal multiculturalism perpetuates a certain normative version of Islam, one that fits into the state's supposedly neutral value sphere, and then I've moved to describe how the Islamophobic discourse becomes mainstreamed. Islamophobia perpetuates an exclusion of Islam in the realm of the state, and the best way to advocate for a policy change here is for activists and advocacy groups to deploy the language of rights and of civil liberties. This civil rights approach is helpful, but I would argue that it's not the only approach that we should pursue. The problems must be met mutually, not unilaterally. Part of the problem with Islamophobia discourse in the West is that it creates a situation where Muslims living in the West feel frightened to air their dirty laundry, as we saw with the Why Do They Hate Us article and Mona Al-Tahawi. Even non-practicing Muslim academics that I have engaged at various conferences and events are very frightened to publicly talk about some of the problems that are happening within their own community. This is one of the negative side effects of Islamophobia. The damage that this discourse has done to the overall quality of the dialogue on Islam is in part responsible for the fact that most Westerners claim to know very little about Islam. In fact, after 9/11, according to Gallup, 53% of Americans said they knew nothing to little about Islam. 2 years ago, that increased to 56%. And supposedly Islam is the fastest growing religion in the United States. Now, it's well known that the Dr. Martin Luther King did not frame civil rights in terms of tolerance or even as a interfaith dialogue, but he framed it in terms of justice and in terms of equality. While we have seen policies in the intervention of government in perpetuating certain perceptions of Islam, I would argue that the biggest challenge is a cultural challenge. While making substantive changes to foreign policies over Kashmir in India, Israel-Palestine, the ongoing illegal drone strikes in Afghanistan, and many other issues would go a long way in helping this issue, I suggest that we must also urgently promote a cultural strategy that seeks to humanize Muslim life and Muslim culture in the media. Now, interfaith dialogue, grassroots coalition building, and social justice work is also very important because it's able to link this problem of Islamophobia to other problems, immigration, the Occupy Wall Street movement. as a larger narrative of social struggle. But if we want to draw an analogy for how combating prejudice towards Muslims, I think the best analogy is homophobia. Robert Wright, a New York Times columnist, wrote a wonderful essay called Homophobia and Islamophobia. Now, this may not be the most glamorous example for Muslims, but it does present, I think, a model, but also a challenging model. Wright argues that over 40 years, homosexuals living in the West were, and we're now at a point, as you all know, where the majority of people generally accept this identity in the public sphere, right? But Wright shows that this acceptance took a long time, but it happened, and we were actually just talking about this before the event. It happened by concealing the identity, keeping the identity on the margins, and getting to know the other as a human being, where upon a certain time we reached the point where actually people could be openly gay. But that took 30, 40, 50 plus years. So Wright argues that this could happen for Muslims using Putnam's bridging model of coming into contact, but he thinks that the population of Muslims in the West is too small for it to actually occur. Now, I would argue that this is where interfaith dialogue becomes the most important, because it is here where we can have an authentic exchange. I do not want to see a situation where Muslims are forced into a dialogue where their differences are dissolved, where everything becomes watered down, or where they have to become part of the multicultural sort of bland landscape. But we want to promote an exchange where they can actually come with their real selves, with their real identity, with their real rituals, with where they really come from. Now, to do this, I think we can turn to the founding fathers of the United States of America. The founding father of religious freedom in America is Rogers Williams. He's actually the founder of Rhode Island. And Rogers Williams talked about the moral imagination. He actually went out and spent a great deal of time living with Native Americans. And his exposure to and work with Native Americans became the basis for our conception of religious freedom, which is a conception of religious freedom that is globally so vital right now. So I think with this model of engagement, through a bridging model that is seeking to really confront differences, a dialogue based on differences. I was recently in a conversation with a Southern Baptist. Now, there's a lot of interfaith dialogue pacts and declarations that have occurred. Most famously is the Common Word. This was when the Pope gave a negative speech about the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and Muslims actually responded through a gesture of reconciliation. They had 300 clerics meet the Pope, the latest Pope, at the Vatican, and they forged a pact called the Common Word between us and you, which said that at the core of our theologies, we can actually come together on respect for loving oneself and loving one neighbor, and a common belief in monotheism and so on and so on. Now, virtually every single denomination of Christianity signed on to this pact except for the Southern Baptists. And I asked them, why didn't they sign on to this pact? And he said that we would not want to see a world where our religion becomes the minority. We would want to engage in a dialogue based on a set of differences, not based on a kumbaya sense of, oh, we're all the same, and this kind of watered down thing. So I think that we should be taking our dialogue to that level. We should be seeking to find those people that cannot necessarily get behind the narrative of commonness, the narrative of unity, but that can actually get behind a narrative of respect and a narrative of privacy. Now, to truly promote this shift and to truly promote this sort of dialogue and this sort of cultural engagement that really humanizes Muslims, we must take an active role in supporting Muslims to build their own cultural narratives. Now, to do this, we need to actually turn to the media. We need to promote the opportunity for the next Muslim Cosby show, for the next Muslim comedian, for these sorts of figures to enter into the public sphere where they can become catalysts for transforming mainstream culture and mainstream images of what Islam is. So as supporters of this effort, I think that what we can do is support this process based on compassion. I think we can support this process based on a dialogue that seeks to really examine the differences that might one day unite us. So with that said, I've gone much too long, and I've gotten very excited, and it's been wonderful to be with you. I will turn it over to my esteemed panelists, and I really look forward to a robust discussion afterwards. So thank you so much for your time.
That's okay, yeah. We may as well fix that so we don't get screensavers. We did have a little program in Canada, Daniel, called Little Mosque on the Prairie, that did a little bit anyway to change some attitudes. I was thinking when you were talking of a conversation I had some years ago with the former Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia, David Lamb, and we were talking about the cultural diversity of British Columbia, particularly Chinese, Caucasian, all that interplay. And he said to me, I really dislike the word tolerance. And he said tolerance, and then he went like this. He said respect. Respect. Yeah. We have a distinguished panel, and they're each going to speak to us for about 10 minutes. I teased Maruna that I have a gong, but I don't have a gong, but we'll watch our time. Maruna Ghani is a British Chevening scholar. She holds a Master of Arts degree in Gender and Development from the University of Sussex Institute of Development Studies. She was the former director of the Multiculturalism and Anti-Racism Program Embrace BC with the British Columbia Provincial Government. And prior to this, a program policy analyst who developed a provincial strategy to prevent violence against immigrant women, self-identified visible minority women, Aboriginal women, and women with disabilities. With 20-some years as a gender anti-racism diversity specialist, has led her to the formation of a consulting company focused to help and build organizations. Not only is giving back to her community her passion, so is poetry and creative writing. As a published poet, you'll find her reading at an open mic somewhere around the Lower Mainland, but tonight at SFU. Maruna Ghani.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. This is a greeting of how Muslims say hello, and it means peace be with you. I'd like to thank Robert Dom and Am Joel for the invitation tonight and for me to be a part of this panel. It's truly an honor. And it's an honor to share the stage with Daniel Tutt and to hear your conversation. And I look forward to the conversation with everybody here. I recently had a very interesting dialogue with a reverend friend of mine. And in this discussion, we were talking about roles and identities and who am I, who are we? And he shared a story, but he first said to me, the Hebrew word for God is Yahweh. And when Yahweh was asked, who are you? The answer that was given was, I am who I am. In Sanskrit, the word Hamsa is a mantra that some people use, some Hindu people use. Hamsa means I am that. And that is capitalized T with a capital T, and it means I am the divine. A few years ago, I had the privilege to hear the Dalai Lama here in Vancouver, and he made a statement which has always resonated and stuck with me. Quote, once we remove the religious labels, mentally, emotionally, physically, we are all human. With this in mind, I'm here to say, I am who I am. And without all my various labels, I'm human. Although I've reached a point in my life where I try very hard not to use labels, even though my bio had a lot of labels, and I try not to define myself with labels, the reality is that society socially constructs us in labels, in roles, in definitions, and often people assume by knowing your label, your role, that they know who you are. For example, I've often been asked, what kind of Muslim are you? By both Muslims and non-Muslims. Because people are trying to figure out, am I Ismaili, am I Shiite, am I Sunni, etc., etc. And I refuse to answer that question. Unfortunately, I have experienced overt and systemic racist and sexist attitudes throughout most of my life. And so here I begin. To segue into the way I want to talk in the 10 minutes that I have is about the experiences that I've had, my personal narrative, as Daniel talked about earlier about practical and narrative, my personal narrative that has driven me to be proactive as an activist and a practitioner to shape opportunities around interfaith and intercultural work that I have been committed to. So there's three specific contexts that were pivotal moments for me that I want to talk about. The first, Gulf War, 9/11, and then basically my role in government when there was a series of events that took place, and I'll get to that. So let's go back. Early 90s, the first Gulf War. I will quickly say that at that time, I was in a volunteer organization, and I was a director for this Muslim organization in Victoria. And our organization were doing social activities and community activities and religious activities. We got together to pray, fast together. We exchanged information. We had potlucks and picnics. And we also gave back to the non-Muslim community. We volunteered in senior facilities as a way to engage with people and so that people could understand who we are. One day, the president of our organization received a call from CSIS. CSIS is Canadian Security Intelligence, for anyone who doesn't know, kind of like the FBI. The president was asked, do you know if there are any terrorists in Victoria? And of course, he was shocked, and he said, no, I don't know of any terrorists in Victoria. Then the person from CSIS proceeded to read a list of names. And on that list was the names of all of us, myself and the board members. And he was asked, are any of these people terrorists, and are they from Canada? And he proceeded to say, no, and we're all from Canada. That was my first lesson and my first question around, do we really live in a democratic country? And what does democracy really mean? So then there were two opportunities around this time. A colleague came to me and asked, how would members of your community feel about coming to the Unitarian Church to speak to our congregation about Islam and Muslims? And I asked her, why? What's happening? And she said, there's a lot of negative portrayal in the media. There's so much negative perceptions that are being painted, and people in the congregation, some of the people are really fearful, and they want to know who is a Muslim and what is Islam about, and are Muslims really like what the media is portraying? So I said, yes, that would be a great opportunity. The second example was at Camosun College. They had a similar public lecture like this, and they invited a couple of members from our organization to speak. One of the people was a professor of Islamic art at the University of Victoria. And she wore traditional Islamic dress, a long robe and a headscarf. And with all intentions that were really good, the intentions were really positive, the public started to focus specifically, many people were focusing specifically on her clothing, as opposed to talking about the Gulf War. And they were asking questions that were, are you oppressed? You know, you're wearing this, is that really your choice? And so there was this, you know, and it was, I don't want to paint a picture that the intentions are not good, but it was leading down a road of very subliminal questions around this oppression and that this woman didn't have a choice. So at that moment, she removed her hijab hijab is a headscarf, in front of all these people. The entire audience gasped. And those of us who are Muslim, we were in shock. And for her to do that was a huge choice that she made to do it publicly. And me being Muslim, knowing how important that was for her, and that connection to that clothing and the symbol is very spiritual. And she did that to make a point. And that was what she wanted to stand by. But for me as a Muslim woman, it was also very pivotal, because it was something very empowering for all of us that she took a stand. So these examples are are just brief highlights about the educational opportunity that existed, and there was a reaching out from different sides to have a proactive and genuine conversation. And I have to be honest that some of us within the organization, we had our assumptions: white equals Christian. And so in doing these kinds of dialogues, it meant we would learn from each other, which is very important. So I'm going to fast forward 9/11. I returned from the UK after completing my master's a few days after 9/11. And I was a little bit nervous about traveling through the airport, and I have been hearing all kinds of stories. In the UK, nothing happened. Everything was fine. There was a little more security, but I was fine. It wasn't until Canada, when I reached the Canadian airport, and I was, they looked at my ticket and everything, and then the security pulled me aside. And I had to go through a series of questions. Why were you there? Why were you there for a year? How long? What were you doing? What were you studying? And what I realized, then they looked at my ticket and they said, why did your ticket say you were supposed to travel on September 10th and you came a few days later? And that was the trigger for the questioning, and they wanted to know why I changed the date and why didn't I fly on September 10th. And so I basically said I had to hand in my thesis, and I handed it late. And so then I had to prove that I was registered in the university. I had to pull out my thesis and show them. And that was when I first learned about racial profiling. And I could go on and talk about many other stories, and I'm sure there's lots of people who have similar stories, but I won't go on. So when I arrived and I came back to Victoria, that's where I was living, there was a huge media frenzy, very similar to what happened with the first Gulf War. Things like focused so much on Muslim women's oppression, Afghanistan women need to be saved, and I was bombarded with invitations to speak about Muslim women's oppression. I refused this. I need people to really understand there are a few struggles I've encountered, and perhaps some of my Muslim friends have too. One, the outward public fight against racism and quote-unquote Islamophobia. Two, the internal struggle of patriarchy, violence, abuse of power that some of us Muslims experience from a few, very few, right-wing extreme people who do exist in our communities. I will not deny that. Three, the propaganda generated both within and outside the West. I have to state that prejudice exists everywhere. I have traveled in so many countries and I've seen it. And it exists within and outside of Muslim communities. 4, the appropriation of voices from the West. For example, we need to save the poor Muslim woman. Muslim women are fighting and defending themselves within our communities. Why don't we see these images? We need to stop speaking for Muslims or Muslim women. They need to be invited to speak. 5th, some Muslims fear huge consequences, intimidation, violence, and sometimes even death from speaking up. I have personally experienced intimidation by a few right-wing Muslim men for speaking when I was in Victoria, and that is part of my reason for not often speaking in engagements like this, but I've reached a different point in my life now. So where do I put my energy? Tariq Ramadan, who's a scholar from the UK, has pointed out violence has nothing to do with religion, but has everything to do with human beings. I also agree when he says some people interpret religious text as a form of power and domination. This is across all faiths. Inequity exists in every community. So then, in conflict, why are we not talking about humans being violent towards one another without labels? For me, the opportunity lies in working with others to educate people from any of our spaces that we come from any of those roles that we take on to make change, like government, academia, NGOs, etc. So this leads me to my final part of my talk, my time in government. So keep in mind it was a few years, and the context that was going on: London bombing, Danish cartoon, Paris riot, Toronto arrests. And during this time, what I saw happening were discussions taking place at a government, academic, NGO, and policy tables linking, quote, the problem with multiculturalism, end quote, to security, nationalism, extremism, religious pluralism, and immigrants who import their conflicts. This was a very subtle form of systemic racism that was surfacing, and I felt this to be extremely dangerous, especially with all these various sectors at policy tables. So, because of all these experiences I've had and I've observed, I decided it was very important to be proactive in dispelling fears. In terms of opportunity, the focus has to be on creating mechanisms that would deal with positive approaches, work on building relationships, as Daniel mentioned, and achieve an understanding of intersecting identities. For example, people's faith and spirituality, along with their many other complex identities, cultural, ethnic, racial, etc. To summarize Will Kimlicka's paper that he did for the federal government, he mentions to address the anti-Muslim sentiment that have been on the rise in the last decade in Canada, and Islamophobia seen as a distinct form of racialization, measures that are more specific and appropriate to such issues are needed instead of just general anti-racism initiatives. In the provincial government, when I was working there, the Interfaith Bridging Program was something that I led the development on, and it was very important for me to see something like that that supported interfaith and intrafaith initiatives. This initiative, this program, has been seen as a measure, a specific measure, and it's now seen as a promising practice, which is very rewarding. So to close, like some of my friends of Muslim backgrounds, I have chosen not to belong to any one Muslim community or any one Muslim organization. Sometimes I don't even say that I'm Muslim, and it's not because I'm afraid, it's because I want to create an opportunity to have a dialogue, because sometimes if some people hear I'm Muslim, then they are not open to having a conversation with me. And I will use that label for specific purposes like tonight. Some might not agree with my approach, but that's okay. In my heart, I know who I am. I attach myself not to labels, but to others who have similar values, whether they are Muslim or not. So I close with a verse from the Quran, and it's from Surah Al-Hujurat, and Surah means chapter. It's chapter 49, verse 13, and I chose an interpretation that speaks mostly to me and has guided me in my interfaith and intercultural work. Quote, "And we made you into nations and tribes, that you may know each other, not to despise and fight each other because he or she is different." Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May peace, mercy, and blessings of God be with you. Thank you very much for listening tonight, and I look forward to the conversation.
Ali Lakhani is a Cambridge graduate who has practiced law in Vancouver for 34 years, including advocacy at the Supreme Court of Canada. An Ismaili Muslim, Ali has served at the highest levels in his community in Canada and internationally, and also as a volunteer for the Law Society and as a governor and director in several arts organizations in the city. In 1998, Ali founded Sacred Web, a biannual print journal that explores the relevance of faith in the modern world. This journal is now the leading publication in its field and has garnered accolades from Prince Charles, the Dalai Lama, Karen Armstrong, Houston Smith, amongst others. In 2001, Ali won the first prize for his paper on the metaphysics of human governance at the Imam Ali Conference in Tehran, Iran. Please welcome Ali Lakhani.
Thanks, Peter, for that introduction. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Anne, for the invitation. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I have 10 minutes and I have a lot to say, so let me get on with it. What I plan to do is to enter the topic of Islamophobia by asking a question which I think it is helpful to ask at the beginning. Is there anything inherent within Islam that would justify Islamophobia, or fear or loathing? Now, most of us, I think, know the answer to that, and why then does Islamophobia exist? I'll define Islamophobia as an exaggerated fear, hatred, hostility towards Islam and Muslims, which feeds on negative stereotypes with the motivation or result of marginalizing or discriminating against Muslims. Let's just do a quick word association. Excuse me. Hijab, the oppression of women. Sharia law, stoning, decapitation, barbarism. Muslim equals terrorist. Mosques, Trojan horses. Madrasas, places of indoctrination, breeding ground for terrorists. Jihad equals religion of the sword. The Quran, the manifesto for evil. Now, you might think that these views, these stereotypes, are held by bigoted people, but not by intellectuals, those in our society that we look up to. Well, let's examine that. I'll start with a quotation by Sam Harris from the Daily Beast in an article called "What Obama Got Wrong About the Mosque." He says, "There is no such thing as Islamophobia. Bigotry and racism exist, of course, and they are evils that well-intentioned people must oppose. And prejudice against Muslims or Arabs purely because of the accident of their birth is despicable, but like all religions, Islam is a system of ideas and practices, and it is not a form of bigotry or racism to observe that the specific tenets of the faith pose a special threat to civil society." Now, this idea that Islam poses a special threat to civil society, Daniel Tutt spoke about Ibn Taymiyyah, of course, and the notion that the laws of the land are paramount. Why then is there such a movement to ban Sharia law? Is it because Sharia law is misunderstood? And we might say, well, Sam Harris is a bad example, but take this. Islam, this quote, Islam has a total organization of life that is completely different from ours. It embraces simply everything. One has to have a very clear understanding that it is not simply a denomination that can be included in the free realm of a pluralistic society. Islam is not pluralistic. Who said that? Pope Benedict. Now, Sir Winston Churchill spoke about Mohammedanism, that's how he referred to Islam, as a militant and proselytizing faith propagated by the sword. Richard Dawkins spoke about Islam deserving special criticism on account of the logical consequences of its dogma, namely that the murder of fellow human beings is to be rewarded with paradise. Sam Harris again, Islam is more than any other religion human beings have devised. It has the marks of a thoroughgoing cult of death. The notion that Islam is a religion of peace, that there is no compulsion in religion, that Islam promotes pluralism, which anyone who has studied the Quran knows. These are not things that intellectuals nowadays and people that we look up to in the West seem to believe. This sense of otherness is promoted by certain kinds of people. Oriana Fallaci, for example, says the increased presence of Muslims in Italy and in Europe is directly proportional to our loss of freedom. She speaks about the Muslim religion wanting to annihilate other religions. Now, when you get this kind of language, what tends to happen is that it breeds hostility. And so it's not surprising that you get a reaction towards Islam when this kind of rhetoric about Islam is out there. Ann Coulter, I will just quote one example. Ann Coulter, we should invade their countries, kill their leaders, convert them to Christianity. Now, I'm sure that many in the audience will be familiar with names like Frank Gaffney, Daniel Pipes, people who speak about Muslims, who speak about Islam in a very derogatory way. My contention is that there is nothing inherent in Islam that justifies Islamophobia. Because Islam, like all faith traditions, is a message of truth and piety, of faith and virtue, of harmony and compassion. Daniel Tutt spoke about governmentality as one strategy to try to bind diverse and disparate elements in society. In Islam, the bindingness, the glue, comes from the doctrine of Tawheed, of an essential oneness that underlies diversity. Islam is essentially a pluralistic religion. There are passages in the Quran that speak about messengers having been sent for every community. These are not just messengers to the Ahl al-Kitab, or the people of the book, as is commonly assumed to be the case. The Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, is told, about some of these messengers we have told you, of others we have not. There are passages in the Quran that speak about salvation being open to all people, people who believe and people who act virtuously. Those are the only two criteria. People who believe. What do they need to believe in? They need to believe essentially in what all religions teach, which is that there is a oneness underlying the diversity in reality. There is an essential oneness. That we are not here by accident, that we are here as creatures, and that if we recognize our essential oneness, our intrinsic oneness, that we will be accountable to it in terms of our actions, in terms of living in accordance with the harmony that we discern. And that is the foundation of the ethic of virtue and compassion. In one of the central concepts in Islam is the concept of rahmah, of compassion. It's often said, it was said to me many years ago by a friend of mine who wanted to engage me in writing an article about how, while Christianity is a religion of love, Islam has nothing to say about love. I mean, that is just not true at all. Muslims say their prayers with words that begin Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. God is defined in terms of the word Rahman, the merciful, the most merciful. The Quran has God say, I have prescribed mercy upon myself. My mercy encompasses all things. The very word Rahma, in its root, means womb. It denotes the very matrix in which we live. And that matrix holds all of us. So this notion that Islam is not pluralistic, this notion that Islam is barbaric, this notion that it is beyond the pale of civil society, is totally foreign to anyone who has studied Islam or knows anything about it. So why then do we have Islamophobia as a phenomenon? And I'm going to suggest that there are three main reasons that I want to focus on. First is because it's not easy for people to distinguish between religion and what is done in the name of religion. There are many things, for example, like honor killings, female genital mutilation, the cultural oppression of women, which are not religious at all. But these things are portrayed as being religious. They're given the cachet of being religious when they're not. And yes, it is true, there are many Muslim societies where these cultural, societal, horrific things happen. That does not mean that these are religious in origin. However, intellectuals, people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Irshad Manji, have made a name for themselves, saying things against Islam. I mean, Irshad Manji's first book was originally titled The Trouble with Islam. It was only later that it was changed to The Trouble with Islam Today. But these are people who don't always make the distinction between religion and politics, religion and culture. So that's the first reason. The second reason is that we live in a time where there is a general opposition towards religion itself. And there is a very strong secularist trend in society. And Islam, which is quite a prominent religion, gets caught up in the attacks of secularist dogmatists. You can think of people like Christopher Hitchens. Now, for example, if somebody is carrying out an atrocity and shouting out, Allahu Akbar, you can understand why somebody like Christopher Hitchens would write a book titled God is Not Great. But what he's really reacting to is something that is done in the name of religion that is not truly religious. So we've got secular dogmatism, we have scientism, this whole notion of faith and science being opposed, which they're not. But there is a sense, I mean, you'll see this particularly among neo-Darwinists, Richard Dawkins, I suppose, being the best example. He wrote the book, The God Delusion. It is part of a drift where you basically say that the world can be reduced to the material world that is measurable, quantifiable, that science can say something about. And anything that is beyond that is really, it doesn't exist, and people who believe in it are guilty of superstition. Islam is a religion, and like all religions, it has a lot to say about the big questions. Why are we here? What is reality? How should we govern our relationships with ourselves? And naturally, in order to answer those questions, religion and Islam itself as a faith tradition permeates all aspects of life. I want to say something about how we can distinguish usefully between three stances towards religion. Religion has three stances: exclusivism, which is a fundamentalist tendency. It tends to focus on form over essence, on the letter over the spirit, on exclusivism instead of pluralism. So, exclusivism is one stance. Inclusivism is a syncretist, diluting stance and tendency within religion. It tends to absorb everything by really diluting. Again, Daniel Tutt spoke about this earlier. And the third stance is pluralism, but pluralism is a relativistic tendency. And I think it's very important to make sure that when we speak of pluralism, we understand that we are not speaking of anything goes. We're not justifying or legitimizing the notion. We should not be legitimizing the notion that anything goes. There has to be a principled basis to religious pluralism. The biggest influence that I need to speak about as a cause of Islamophobia is its reaction to modernism. Now, there's a long history behind this. We can speak about Islam and Christendom, the misunderstandings between the threats that are felt by the Christian world, the dominant Christian world, in the face of the Muslim conquests, the Crusades, Dante's consignment of the Holy Prophet of Islam to the lowest circles of hell. With the advent of the rise of the West for various reasons, we have had some reactions to that. We have had colonialism with its legacies in Israel and Kashmir and Lebanon. We have had interference by the West in other countries for economic reasons, for oil, for example, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Afghanistan, Western interference in various domestic matters in other countries, Egypt, Iraq, the Mossadegh overthrow in Iran, Afghanistan, the muzzling of dissent, the support of directors, the hypocrisy of governments in the West that basically say there's a double standard when it comes to what we will tolerate other countries, the standards in other countries. We wouldn't allow that here, but we'll tolerate it in other countries because we get our way for other reasons. The muzzling of dissent, which tends to radicalize Muslims. We've now seen that break out in the Arab Spring. And of course, I would say the sort of four defining events in the last 60, 70 years, the creation of the State of Israel with all the wars that have happened after that, the Iranian Revolution in 1979, the Gulf Wars, 9/11. I think all of these have tended to radicalize Muslims. And what has happened as a result is that Muslims have tried to speak out. They have been suppressed in many cases. And instead of giving them a democratic means to express their opinions, which is now hopefully going to happen in the Arab world, it has actually been stifled and has exploded. We have also seen the effects of modernism in terms of a reaction by some elements in Islam, which have said, we associate the West with everything that is bad. We want to return to a very conservative, fundamentalist kind of Islam, Salafism, Wahhabism. Of course, with the rise of the oil-producing countries and the petrodollar and the proselytizing that has happened with all of that, all those elements have led to a certain expression of Islam that is not representative of mainstream Islam, and it has now gotten hold within the media. It has gotten hold within, it has contaminated the academic world. And so I just want to turn, because I know my time is up, I just want to turn to certain strategies that we need to think about seriously. We need a strategy of trying to understand what the causes of Islamophobia are. We need to rediscover the touchstones of religion. I was one of the signatories to the Common Word dialogue, and we need that sort of a dialogue occurring. And the Charter of Compassion is another one. We just had Karen Armstrong in this city. We need that sort of a dialogue. And to end my presentation, I'll just give you a quotation which I love from Mansur al-Hallaj, the Sufi mystic who was put to death in Baghdad many years ago. He says, I've meditated on the different religions, endeavoring to understand them, and I have found that they stem from a single principle with numerous ramifications. Do not, therefore, ask a man to adopt a particular religion rather than another, for this would separate him from the fundamental principle of all religions. It is this principle itself which must come to seek him. In it are all the heights and all the meanings elucidated. Then he will understand them. Thank you very much.
Now, just checking our time, we have three more excellent presenters this evening, so we'll keep moving and maybe extend our time by about 5 minutes at the end so the members of the audience have a time to respond. Simi Ghazi is lecturer in classical Arabic at University of British Columbia. She has lectured widely on the Quran, Islamic literature and spirituality, and Islam and gender. Simi recites Quran and performs Muslim devotional song in Arabic, Persian, Turkish, and Urdu. Her recitations have been featured on the BBC, CBC, and PBS documentary Empire Faith. Simi Ghazi.
So we'd noticed there was a nice transition from theoretical to narrative. And I'm going to start with the personal and maybe end with the political. My daughter is 12 years old. She likes mathematics, glistening orange sushi cones, The Big Bang Theory on television. I won't tell you her name because it's personal to her, but it means exaltation. And of course, we gave it to her with high hopes. Because of this name, at the age of 12, she's on a secondary checklist, which means that every time we fly, as we often do across the border, since my family is in the United States, they pull us all aside and go through our bags and ask us a number of questions. My mother in the United States is also on such a list for that matter. She earned 4 terminal master's degrees while raising 5 children with no babysitter ever. Those terminal master's degrees didn't kill her. She went on and she got a PhD in education. She used to rush home from teaching Islamic school at the Muslim Community Center in Chicago and prepare mounds of halal samosas for us. And we would munch them at halftime while she would rush to make extra prayers, nawafil, for her boys, her betas, the Chicago Bears. And when my father would complain that she ought to dedicate her worship to people suffering in Afghanistan, in Palestine, in South Africa, she would reply that this was not a zero-sum game, and she had plenty of barakah, of blessing, to go around. And this father of mine, his name also causes him to be stopped. He is a poet, he's a scholar, he's increasingly frail, he's in his 70s. He has a doctorate in comparative religion. He's a Muslim who teaches Taoism, Hinduism, Buddhism. He's been invited to the White House, so he has a White House security clearance, and he has received countless awards as an educator and peacemaker. I'm not saying this because only people with PhDs in comparative religion should have civil rights. But I'm saying this because he's a model American Muslim. And that doesn't render him invulnerable in any way. I have watched my father tremble with dignity and with humiliation as he was pulled aside at YVR, made to open his suitcase in front of his daughter, which somehow made it more poignant, more painful. And then to tear the colored paper and the shiny bows off all the carefully selected and charmingly wrapped gifts he had purchased for his grandchildren. Now, Daniel, I'm a storyteller, and I'm a singer, and I'm a poet. I'm not an analyst of Islamophobia. I'm analytical about grammar, about literature. But I've never told these stories, not in public. And I sat with your wonderful paper, and I marked it up with notes, responding to what you had to say about the history and the theory and the practical struggle against Islamophobia. And then I started to chart my British, American, Canadian Muslim history. In fact, I hold 3 passports. And my own experiences of prejudice and Islamophobia by your rubric. And I should note that I'm premillennial, and I grew up on university campuses in the heart of the counterculture. I was schooled by Quakers in non-polemical discourse, and those who know me know that I grew up singing Kumbaya, and I live and exude that spirit. One of my formative memories is of hanging out with my mother in Harvard Square and taking in the life there. And in those contexts, not really being aware that I was Muslim, we were Indian, and that meant that we were good at math and that we were highly involved spiritually. And my mother would get all the Hare Krishna chicks and straighten out their saris, because she came from sort of an aristocratic North Indian background. If you were going to wear a sari, you had to wear it properly, and they would, exchange recipes. This was kind of my experience. So, if anything, my otherness as a child was an idealization of where I came from. But obviously, I had blocked something out. And you did inspire me to look at it. So I thought about general aversion to the other. And I realized that actually when we moved to Skokie, Illinois in 1979, where the Nazis had marched just a few months before, and where there was a very complex, mixed, religious, ethnic, racial transformation taking place that created a lot of xenophobia and insecurity, that our neighbor planted a hedge between our house and his house on a street where our little brick houses were not separated by hedges. And then I remembered that actually one night we were standing in the alley outside, And this neighbor was intoxicated and yelling racial epithets and telling us to go home. And a fire truck had to be called because our garage was on fire and someone had pulled the garbage cans next to the garage and lit them ablaze. And then I thought about governmental Islamophobia. Well, first, no, non-governmental Islamophobia. Real Islamophobia, not just generalized prejudice. I think this started after the Iranian embassy incidents. And it has to do with names again, because my parents run a foundation called Iqra, and Iqra means read or recite, and it's the first word of the Quran. And it's again in Skokie, not 5 minutes from our house. And I remember that my father was sitting there and came home one day, and bullets had been shot through the window of this, through the windows. And he hadn't been harmed, but after that there was an erasure of this name. And instead of saying Iqra, it said IIIE, which stood for Iqra International Educational Foundation. And this is the kind of rendering invisible that became increasingly necessary for us to feel safe in this American suburb, which calls itself proudly the largest American village. So there's a kind of nice, maybe, contradiction in that. But then I thought about governmental Islamophobia. And every single time we fly, we're stopped. And I thought, I don't know whether people who are not Muslim are aware of this. I do not say it in any interfaith gathering to my Jewish friends, to my Christian friends, when we worship together, when we talk comparative theology together, when we share chants or meditations, when I go to disrupt people's stereotypes of Muslims, of Muslim women, of Islam. These are experiences that I don't talk about. And the things that I've experienced, I think, are important because they are the common experience of Muslims in North America today. They are not as serious on one level as rendition to torture. But they are part of the slippery slope that makes that possible. And I think that all Muslims in North America that I know live with a very deep rupture, a deep fissure, a deep vulnerability in our relationship to the state and in our relationship to our communities, because we are always vulnerable and we really know that we do not possess the fundamental democratic rights in the name of which, in fact, the war of terror, the war on terror, the war of terror is being waged. So I thank you because you gave me a structure for thinking about these things, and you made me realize that I need to speak these things. I need to write these experiences. They are deeper than I acknowledged. And I panicked for a moment today, actually, and I couldn't really breathe, and I just sat with my feelings. And for someone who's very touchy-feely and very clued into herself, I was shocked at the shame, the rage, and the grief that I felt for myself, but also for my daughter, more than that for my daughter. and I'm going off the page now, I think I like to conclude by talking about two daughters of mine, and one is a niece of mine. And I want to talk about the effects of Islamophobia, because there was I think I had here. Yeah, I cannot concur with government authorities or anti-terrorism experts that outbursts of Islamophobia are most problematic because they might serve as the cause for violence or for homegrown terrorism. The biggest victims of Islamophobia, the victims are Muslims. So there's my daughter, whom I have to tell, you're on this list, and it's because of your name. And this is a complicated, delicate matter when I'm trying to instill in her Islamic identity and dignity and pride, to also say, and you are possibly subject to surveillance by the state. You are suspect. And it's also damaging for my other daughter, my niece, who lives in a different environment, who's not unaware as my daughter is, and I have to kind of destroy her innocence because she has to be knowing and she has to act an analytical way to understand this, and she has to develop the voice that will enable her as a Muslim woman to avoid being pinned down. I love the line by Eliot that says, when I am pinned and wriggling on a wall, then how shall I presume? I think this is the struggle of every Muslim woman. How shall I presume? And we all use our smarts and our wits and our sly techniques and our artistry, and we try to avoid being pinned down. That strategy of removing the veil. I have a strategy where I wear my scarf and I remove my scarf. But my other daughter is my niece, and she has been subject to brutal bullying. She's been taken out of school, she's had to be homeschooled, and she lives in New York State. She has children tremble when they discover that she's Muslim in fear. And recently she went to a new school, and there was a comparative religion class, and the teacher was teaching art history and had everybody draw a flower, and then looked up and said, now, if you were Muslim, you would go to hell for doing that. Because Muslims aren't allowed to depict anything or create anything, since God is the only creator. But since Muslims are actually people and they need to create, they use this loophole and they make all these abstract depictions of nature. And this was backed up with hadith, traditions of the Prophet, and the isnads, the lineages of these traditions. I mean, it was argued on this kind of Islamic, pseudo-Islamic basis. And that event led to a serious increase. Things had been going well, and all of a sudden people came up to her and said, you didn't draw a flower because you didn't want to go to hell. And she said, well, I did draw a flower. But the dynamic of these things is that once you're stigmatized and once you're vulnerable and once that is authorized by teachers or by public intellectuals or by the state, it's very hard to transform that dynamic. And I think, although I am not a political scientist, that geopolitics, foreign policy for me is at the heart of this. And there are important parallels to be made, and I like the parallels you made with homophobia and contact. But I think we have to look at how Islamophobic propaganda, by dehumanizing Muslims and by rendering their deaths and their disappearances and their suffering invisible, makes possible the conditions for the war on terror and expands neocolonialism and the interests of power and the desire for increase in energy, water and water routes, ports, territory, labor. I don't think that if we want to really change this, we can do it without a critique of neocolonialism. Because on the one hand, states can assert that jihad is merely struggle, or as Bush famously did, that Islam is a religion of peace, and he stood with Muslim leaders by his side. But I think on the other hand, states rely on this right-wing peddling of fear that they may at one level dispute, and they rely on it to justify government surveillance, rendition to torture, racial profiling, and to consolidate their power and their interests at home and abroad. Thank you.
Paula Carr has worked in the community sector with municipal and provincial departments, supporting intercultural leadership for over 40 years in Ontario, Saskatchewan, British Columbia. Recently, Paula was awarded the Alan Thomas Fellowship with the Carroll Institute. The focus of her fellowship was to explore the developmental processes and approaches to the Renfrew-Collingwood neighbourhood in Vancouver took to build an intercultural community and workplace. Paula Carr.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be here today, and I have to tell you, when Am asked me to come and be on this panel, I was a little perplexed because I didn't really know what I could say about Islamophobia or interfaith dialogue initially, until I started to sort of go back and think about the stories that get created in neighborhoods and communities. Particularly the ones that I've worked in and have had the privilege of witnessing, very positive actions. And so I'm going to be talking a bit about what Daniel was alluding to when he was talking about the contact theory and bridging theory, and how this is a place that really we really need to start thinking about moving towards. As my bio talked about, I have actually had the great pleasure of working in a neighborhood in Vancouver called Renfrew-Collingwood. It's got about a population of 48,000 people, and I actually began working for this neighborhood 25 years ago. And at the time when I started working, it was a very highly underserved area of Vancouver. And it had a fairly small population, much smaller than it is now, about 30,000 people. And it was just at the time it started to grow, because Vancouver was opening up to the global community, and we were seeing a huge amount of immigration happening in communities. And this community was a very wonderful place to settle, because it was quite central into the lower mainland, was fairly affordable housing, really connected to transportation routes, that kind of thing. So when I first started, about 30% of the population in Renfrew-Collingwood had English as a second language. And today, less than, or 25 years later, over 74% have English as a second language. And so that community went through an incredible amount of change, not just with the growth in their population, but actually with the diversity of their population. And like many neighborhoods, neighborhoods are diverse. Not only because of the immigration that happened in our community, do we have the diversity, but we also have all sorts of diversity of faiths, of incomes, of abilities, of generations, of perspectives, of sexual orientations. That's what communities are made of. And when I first started in this community, there were a group of local residents, 5 people that sat around a kitchen table and started to dream and vision a community that they wanted to live in and wanted to create, both for themselves and their families, but also for the generations to come. They were phenomenal leaders. They were all white, Caucasian people living in that community and starting to see the changes that were occurring. Many of them, of their neighbors, had huge fear about these changes and a lot of resistance and intolerance about the changes. But for some reason, these 5 people decided they wanted to take a different route. And what they started to do is they started to envision a community coming together. And they started to envision them all working together to create this community. And because one of the things that they realized is that they needed to reach everybody. Because in order for them to get the kinds of supports they wanted for families, they recognized that all of the people that were coming into our communities really wanted to find supports for their families. All of them wanted to have affordable housing and safe housing. They all wanted to have community and business services closest to home. They all wanted to create a place of home, a place of belonging. So what we started to do was to reach out to people and really go to where they were and invite them to come and help us plan, help us develop, help us work together, help us build these services, these spaces, these places, this philosophy and this approach. And at first we started, I think what one would call in a very traditional multicultural way, where we were really celebrating the diversity and really bringing people together, but really organizing it in what we would call more ethnic-specific kinds of ways, where we actually, would run Chinese English language classes for Chinese people, or we would, we would look at offering these as a way of sort of feeling like we needed to kind of create a similar place to what they were used to in order for them to feel this comfort and belonging. We started to hire local people and recruit local volunteers, but again, having them work specifically with the cultures and the ethnic backgrounds and of where they came from. But soon we began to see that we were really creating a lot of segregation in our communities. And so we decided to move to what we are calling an intercultural approach. And this is really an approach that focuses on building bridges and exchanges between people who are different from one another. And one of the things that's quite profound when you start to do this work is it creates an incredible amount of creativity, of innovation, and of personal growth and development. And this was something we hadn't really anticipated by doing that, but we just recognized that the route that we were taking was creating more segregation than not. And one of the things that was also really wonderful about the approach we were taking is our focus was in a neighborhood context, within a place based in a geographic area. And one of the things that we learned very soon is how important that was, because there was so much spatial connection. You run into people in the local grocery stores, you run into them in the schools, on their way to their faith-based places, you play sports with them, you do all kinds of things. So it's a perfect place to begin to start to bring differences together. So as we began to do that, and one of the first things that we did was we actually built a 26,000 square foot facility that involved 1,000 people from all over the world that brought different skills and abilities to the table. Some people, we had architects from China, we had planners from Chile, we had interior designers from Afghanistan. We had all sorts of different people that brought all kinds of different sorts of skills to the table. And as a result, we created a meeting place that brought everybody's uniqueness together. And it's a place that everybody comes to. It's a meeting place. It's a place where many religious groups and faith-based organizations provide services. We have services all the way from infancy all the way up to our seniors and elders. We bring our generations together. We bring our cultures together. We learn from one another. And we create an opportunity for people to bring their uniqueness forward. And through that uniqueness, actually end up co-creating new realities. One of the things that happened as we started to take this work on, primarily first focusing around ethnic diversity, but we started to see that the kinds of strategies and approaches that we were using to reach the cultural communities in our neighborhood were also ones that we could use to reach other marginalized populations. So collectively, we started to do work in reaching homeless. We started to look at creating health and safety for sex trade workers in our communities. We started to do work with the addicts, and we collectively took on hard social issues that often we don't have agreement upon because of our different faith and belief systems. But one of the things that we agreed on is that we wanted to make the place a better world for everyone, for people that were living in our communities, and all these people were living in our communities. That doesn't mean that we did not have challenges. We still, on a day-to-day basis, ran into situations where we had extreme racism, where people were segregated by other members of the community. And was saying, well, people really want to know about, how you did that. And I have to say that there's not really an easy answer except for being in the moment and really trying to build on the kinds of resources that you have. And thankfully, we had a number of resources that were collective. And we shared a responsibility so that as racism occurred in our community, we would gather around and collectively try to find a way that we could resolve it and bring support to the people who had been victimized or marginalized by certain beliefs. We were all empowered by some common values that I'm going to talk about a little bit later. But we also created environments where we had lots of dialogue, where we were opening up opportunities for people to share. We were curious about people and our differences. We created that kind of energy within the community. And part of that was just by having agreements that people could come to meetings, they could express their opinions. And if we didn't agree with them, it was fine to say you didn't agree with them, but we were going to be leaving as neighbors and as friends and as people who were committed to build a community of humanity. One of the other things, and we've had to at times bring in mediators when things got heated, or we had really difficult conflicts, and we also sought off at times some help from police and people that were there to help create our safety. But one of the stories that I want to share with you, which kind of just gives you a bit of a sense of how this community has come together at times of crisis, is after 9/11. We were seeing a lot of racism start to emerge in our community. We had a Muslim organization that just was situated down the street. And all of us wanted to look at approaching this in a way that we wanted to create peace. That's what we wanted to do, not to create reactions of violence against violence. And so we actually sponsored an evening where we invited our neighbors to come and talk to us about stories of really their resilience. We have a lot of people in our communities who have immigrated into our country because they have come from very difficult situations in their homelands. They have been tortured, they have been asked to leave their countries because of differences of their government and their belief systems. And we have a lot of artists as well in our community who came and brought their stories forward this one evening. And I still remember the poets, the visual artists, the storytellers, the musicians, people coming from the Middle East, from Japan, from Africa, from Chile. The stories were heart-wrenching. One woman from Japan was talking about how her father was one of the survivors of Hiroshima, and the impact that had on her family throughout their lives. People from Chile who had been tortured during the coup and had survived. And all of the stories that people talked about were horrible stories, but they were also inspiring stories in the sense that these people had the strength within themselves to come forward and to come out of those situations as peaceful and humane people. They were the largest contributors in our community. And what was so interesting as people came together that day to tell their stories is as neighbors began to understand their neighbors at a deeper level. They understood the commonality of the situations that they were dealing with, and they became a lot stronger. But what was so inspiring was that everybody came together to say that this is not right, that we have a vision for a better world, and that we want to be able to exercise that. And to me, that was one of the most inspiring moments in my career at the neighborhood house, was just seeing at a time like that when people were feeling so vulnerable and so volatile, how neighbors came together and provided that level of comfort. And also, it began to make me realize how little we know about each other. These are people who had worked together, for many of them, for 10, 15 years, and had absolutely no idea that they shared those kinds of histories. And also the kind of resilience that their spirits had. So if I think about kind of the learnings and reflections of what has been created by this intercultural approach is that the face-to-face connections are incredibly important. That one of the things as I was doing my fellowship study and I was asking people to kind of reflect about, how did you overcome those sorts of fears? Like you had all these attitudes and these fears, and what was it in your own personal kind of experience that allowed you to move forward? Well, I actually met the person. Right? I actually met somebody that was from this culture, had this belief, and I had never been exposed to that before. And I had a conversation with them, and I found out that, my goodness, they have the same kinds of stories that I do. They have the same desires for their families and their children's and their communities. And so that was one thing, is really trying to encourage that face-to-face connection, and neighborhoods are clearly a place to do that. That we did become more dynamic as a community because of our diversity. We did not see it as a challenge, but actually see it as an advantage. And I don't know if any of you have read any of Richard Florida's work, but it's really talking about creating creative cities, and that what he really believes is it's the diversity that actually exposes us to the different perspectives, the different ideas, and allows us to go further than where we currently are. And when I talked to the people in our neighborhood, as I reflected during my fellowship year about what was some of the things that kind of happened for them, is they grew. They grew as individuals, and they grew as a community beyond anything they ever could have imagined. And that was, I think, a real telling story about how, as we bring interculturalism together, it can create a much more dynamic and much more peaceful community. That the dialogue was incredibly important, but for us it was the glue of working together that actually made the difference. That we all now can walk through that community and say, we created this together. We all own this. This is our home, and we did it. With all the different people from different cultures and different languages and different faiths and different generations and different beliefs, we did that. And the other lesson that I think that we've learned is this is incredibly intentional work. You can never let up on it. Even though we have, I think, created a bit of a sophistication about this work, we are constantly learning, we are constantly challenged, and we know that the minute we take our eye off the mark is that we may slip back. And it's very fragile, but it's also something that we think that we can carry forward on. During my fellowship year, one of the things that I was trying to kind of get a handle on is really what are the sort of processes of transformation that people went through. And we ended up actually describing it as a process of being, belonging, and becoming. And by being, it's about really bringing your value to the table, but also being valued by others. Our belonging is really about engaging people to co-create and build something that we all have ownership and can contribute to. And our becoming is really that new growth, that piece that actually not only enriches our communities, but it enriches us personally because we're able to bring our best forward. We also found that we have a lot of common values. And the kind of values, and we do this all the way from early childhood education to our seniors programs, is often when we do things together, we build contracts. We kind of say, okay, how do we want to be in this space together? And what are the things that are important in the values that we want to put forward? And consistently, these are the values that come forward. Respect, which was talked about earlier. Coming into our relationships with both an open heart, but valuing and treating everyone as we would want to be treated. Diversity, again, recognizing it as a strength and an advantage, that we are exposed to so many differences, rather than seeing it as a challenge. Capacity building, which is seeking and supporting the gifts, the skills, the experiences, and providing opportunities for those to come forward. Relationship building, getting to know each other on a personal level and hearing each other's stories. And this requires attention to creating environments for social interaction. Reciprocity. We all have opportunities in our lives where we need support. And we also have opportunities in our lives where we need to contribute. And this is what reciprocity is. It's about giving and taking. And also collaboration and cooperation is that by working together, we can maximize our resources and generate a lot more ideas. And finally, accountability is being accountable to yourself, to your integrity, and to the values that you hold, but also to the neighborhood and the community that you're trying to create. So I hope that this little story about our community will give you some hope for our future. Thank you.
Our last speaker of the evening is Rabbi Dr. Robert Daum, the Associate Professor of Rabbinic Literature, as well as the founding director of the Islamopacific Interreligious Center at Vancouver School of Theology, holding appointments both at the University of British Columbia and Simon Fraser University. Robert brings an education from Tufts University and a rabbinic degree at Hebrew Union College, the Jewish Institute of Religion in New York City, and a PhD in Near Eastern Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. Robert Daum.
I'm delighted to be here for my 10 minutes. I mean, yes, admittedly, some of our speakers have gone a few minutes over, but this is a really important issue, and it's a sign of how important this issue is that so many of you are still sitting here, riveted, really, listening to these wonderful, wonderful speakers. I will be 10 minutes. The last, my most recent educational credential, which Dean Peter Elliott didn't mention in the interest of time, was a certificate in a program that I want to commend to you. It's a program offered here at Simon Fraser University by the Center for the Comparative Study of Muslim Societies and Cultures. It's offered every other summer in Vancouver and every other summer in London. And it's a wonderful intensive on Islam, 80 hours of lectures, 22 professors. The summer I did it over a 2-week period. And I want to share a very brief story about that experience that I had, which was absolutely fantastic. Most of the students in the class were Muslims, and there were also a few Christians and 3 Jews. At the end of the experience, which covered really a broad range of aspects of Muslim societies and cultures, from architecture to art to scriptural interpretation, history, politics, clothing, all kinds of things. 2 of my classmates, whom I enjoyed chatting with during coffee breaks, came up to me right at the end, and they said, what was the most surprising thing you learned about Muslim societies and cultures? And I said, Well, I knew that Muslim societies and cultures were diverse. I'm a professor of the study of religion. I've been working with Muslims for years. I've been reading and studying and learning and so on. I just hadn't appreciated how vastly more diverse Muslim societies and cultures were than I had thought when I started. And of course, it's absurd to think that one could know any complex culture without having lived a lifetime of studying it. And I know that there are many people here who are Muslims and specialists in Islam who would quickly say that they don't know everything there is to know about Muslim societies and cultures, all the more so myself. At any rate, the response was, from my two Muslim classmates was, is there anything like this kind of diversity in Jewish culture? And at first I was shocked, but then I realized how precious this kind of experience is. It is so important. And if I had been able to, I would have taken all of the people in that class and we would immediately have, maybe a week later, with a week break, gone into a 2-week intensive on Jewish cultures and societies. And then there should be another one on Christian cultures and societies, and one on Sikh cultures, and one on Hindu cultures, and First Nations, and so on and so forth. Because that's what we need to do in order to be able to fulfill the potential of what Ibu Patel has referred to in the American context as the American project, but here of the Canadian project. We need to be learning together. We need to be learning about each other, and we need to be learning about the world together. I have an incredible opportunity as someone who has been working in academia for a number of years to be the founding director of an interreligious center. And it's quite a fascinating situation, and I'll just say a few words about it. In addition to having the opportunity, really the privilege of co-sponsoring this event, an event that is so important because it can't only be Muslims who are speaking about Islamophobia. It must be Jews, it must be Christians, it must be others, just as it must be Muslims and Christians and others speaking about anti-Semitism, and people who are not African American or African Canadian talking about racism against their community, and so on and so forth. I heard a fascinating anecdote shared with me at a recent event that I got to attend through my work, in which I learned that there are two envoys who report to the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, appointed by President Obama. One of them is the envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism, and the other one is the special U.S. representative to the Muslim communities. And what I learned was that recently they were at a UN human rights gathering of some kind in Europe, and at the last moment they decided to give each other's speech. Think about that. The impact of the U.S. representative to the Muslim communities delivering a passionate speech articulating the American government's opposition to anti-Semitism. And then the impact of the U.S. envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism issuing a passionate speech condemning Islamophobia. That's really, I think, a model for the kind of work that we need to be doing here in Canada. When we founded our center, Iona Pacific, at a historically multi-denominational Christian Theological College on the UBC campus that had visiting scholars from different religious traditions over the years, here I was, a rabbi, the director of a center in a multi-denominational Christian Theological College. My first decision was to embrace the opportunity to appoint a brilliant Muslim woman as my intern, later senior intern, and our first youth leadership coordinator. It was absolutely critical that the center could not be an interreligious center engaging in any part of the Abrahamic family without all three families represented at the table. And likewise, we work closely with First Nations. And when we inaugurated the center, which is increasingly looking to work with folks in the non-Abrahamic traditions as well, we inaugurated the center. It was 2 weeks before the Vancouver Olympics. And so there was a lot of security anxiety. And in order to assure the comfort of all of our guests, hundreds of guests, leaders of the Muslim communities, the Jewish community, Christian community, First Nations, leaders from the Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist, and Baha'i and other communities who were all invited, we needed to have a hospitality and security group as a kind of greeters of our guests who could be gracious, but who were trained to be alert to people who were going to rush in and harm the guests. It was an infinitesimal risk, but we figured we're gathering all these religious community leaders 2 weeks before the Olympics. We needed to be able to assure our guests that they would be comfortable. So we actually borrowed the hospitality committee of a synagogue that was firebombed 25 years ago in West Point Grey. So while the members of the synagogue were providing hospitality and security for the guests who were arriving for an event that was kosher catered but with no alcohol, there were 2 prayer rooms that were set up upstairs, supervised by our Muslim intern, for our Muslim guests who needed to pray at around sunset so that they could then comfortably come downstairs and not have to rush through traffic to make it to the event. We had 3 judges present in the audience, in the assembly, 2 Supreme Court justices and 1 provincial court judge, 1 Jewish, 1 Muslim, 1 Christian. The chair of the board of UBC, the chair of the board of SFU, deans, professors, a senior member of the Vancouver City Council, hereditary chiefs of our First Nations communities, the Anglican bishop, the president of the United Church of Canada, the Rabbinical Association of Vancouver president, the president of the BC Ismaili Council, leading Sunni imam, a leading Shia imam, etc., etc. You're probably wondering why you didn't read about this in the newspaper. There were several hundred people there at this event. The reason is that what people were reading in the newspaper was a story, the main story in the newspaper in the days right after this event was about people who believe that the world is going to end in 2012. So, I mean, market forces play a role and media plays a role, but still, this is troubling. But it's a story of what happened here in Vancouver not long ago. And there are many stories like that, as you've been hearing this evening. And some of our work is supported by government grants, the kinds of government grants that create multiculturalism and anti-racism programs. So there is this tension that we live with, of living in a society in which someone like Daniel Tutt can provide sensitivity training and educational workshops for people who do counterterrorism work. I mean, that's pretty amazing. It's fascinating, one of those paradoxes. We sponsored an event, and I'll tell you just about 2 more incidents because it is getting late. We sponsored a series of programs looking at complicating the story of Muslim-Jewish-Christian interaction in Spain. And we did it because, as Daniel Tutt mentioned in his remarks, one could look to 7/11 rather than 9/11 as a key date. That is, many people were marking this as the 10th anniversary of 9/11, but we were marking another anniversary. A few of my colleagues and I, researchers at UBC and I, we decided it was important to mark the 1400th anniversary of 7/11. Because we felt it was important to complicate the story that many people accept uncritically of the Iberian Peninsula in Spain as a kind of essentially, originally, naturally, purely Christian place that was contaminated by an alien invading force of Arab Muslims from North Africa. That's more or less the sort of at a popular level the story that then becomes the enabling narrative for another narrative of a necessary reconquest. And what researchers have learned, I think, is that the story is a lot more complicated than that. That in fact the invasion and conquest, essentially, of the formerly Visigothic realm on the Iberian Peninsula in 7/11 was probably a mixture, a coalition of forces, including Byzantines and Berbers and all sorts of folks, and Visigoths and so on. It's a very different story. Eventually an Islamic caliphate emerges, but it's a very different story than the idea of a kind of contamination by an essential outsider. And another peculiar aspect of this is that this conquest, which is some historians believe is really a conquest by the Kingdom of Castile of the southern part of the Iberian Peninsula, some scholars believe that 40% of the forces of the Castilian king who conquered the city of Seville, were Muslims, which in the 13th century. Not only that, but the king who conquered the city of Seville, in the name of the Kingdom of Castile, was buried in the mosque before it became a cathedral. His epitaph includes Arabic and Hebrew. And according to some historical sources, his body was guarded by Muslim soldiers. It's a very much more complicated story, but it's an important story to be told because it helps us to understand why it was, as architecture historians have pointed out, that as the Castilian kingdom's forces were coming south, they were finding churches that didn't look like the churches that they knew back home. In some cases, they were leaving them undisturbed. In other cases, they were refashioning them to make them look like what they thought Christian churches should look like. In other words, not anything like a mosque, as they imagined a mosque should look. And something similar was happening as forces were coming over the strait from North Africa in defense of their co-religionists to defend against the Castilian kingdom's onslaughts. They were finding mosques that, according to architecture historians, didn't look like the mosques they were expecting to find. So in some cases, they were leaving them undisturbed. In other cases, they were remaking them to make them look more like the mosques they knew back home. In other words, what many historians of religion are suggesting is that the boundaries between religions are policed in every generation in such a way as to define them over and against the other as being essentially different. And what we find in the work that we do, and certainly what I find in the work that I do, is that there are differences. There are important differences between religious thinkers and practitioners within religious cultures, and also between religious cultures. And that's important to note. We can learn from each other. We don't all have to be the same. At the same time, there are important opportunities to discover common ground. And that kind of work has happened through a program that we established, inspired and conceived and directed by Dr. Rosa Sevi, my colleague who worked with me, and our youth leadership coordinator, Leah Hirji, at Iona Pacific. Rosa Sevi had this idea that mothers with children of similar age could bridge their differences. And so 20 mothers from 14 nations of origin started meeting and exchanging stories about being mothers of kids of about the same age. And the group, another group is continuing to meet. It's gone on for several years. So there are many opportunities right here in this community to work together to challenge those impediments to the Canadian project. And I think we all have a part to play. We all have a role to play, including every one of you here this evening. I hope to have the opportunity to meet you either this evening or down the road so that we can discover some ways in which we might be able to work together to make Canada not only a safer place for people with differences, but also a culturally far richer, more robust, more compassionate, and ultimately more impactful in positive ways society than it would have been if we didn't have this rich diversity of cultures, civilizations, heritages, and ideas that makes Canada the Canada that I love living in, and that I believe makes the United States, the place where I was born, also potentially an even greater country. Thank you.
Daniel, what an extraordinary evening you've stimulated. And panelists, thank you for your remarks and opening up to us the worlds that you live in and enabling us to meet each other. I make it 9:30. Do you think best 3 questions? Yes. Here comes another mic.
By thanking you all for the wonderful presentations. While I was listening to all of you, one of the things that I was thinking about is another way to understand Islamophobia, and I think that was sort of ellipsed in our conversation tonight, was linking it more profoundly to a history of racialization and taking it away out of the particularities of the Muslim experience. And I think that when we look at a model where we decide that more information or the contact theory that you were discussing will bridge these differences, that kind of makes me question that a little bit, because I don't really believe it is a lack of information that causes this kind of the racialization of the Muslim community that we're undergoing now. And I think the myths that you are talked about, and a number of you mentioned, are not the causes of Islamophobia, but rather the symptoms of Islamophobia. And when any community is marginalized and racialized, these myths that demonize that community originate, and they function as they have a role to play in the way that racialization is enacted. And we know from the history of racialization of every group of people historically that that ideology does a piece of work, and that piece of work is the dominance of that community. And I think it's important to sort of think about this conversation more as a way of how racialization of the Muslim community leads to these kinds of policies and acts of hatred and violence, rather than the other way around. The other thing I want to say is that when we think about it in terms of, well, we just need to get to know each other more, that puts a lot of pressure on Muslim subjectivities, because then Muslims have to be responsible for being the model minority and always taking the brunt of breaking the stereotype, which is particularly borne by Muslim children in public schools, and this is something we don't like. This is not fair. And also, it leads to this idea that, and I think every person of color in this room will know the experience of how many white people they know for whom they are the one person of color that they know. So this kind of model of people of color or people who are racialized bearing the brunt of breaking that is something we might want to rethink.
Thank you. Any response from anyone? I think maybe the statement stands for itself. Thank you. Over here, please. Thank you very much. Oh, there we are. Wait till the mic comes up. It's coming right there, okay? I know you think you can be heard, but...
I might lose my train of thought.
Here we go.
So, I hear what she's saying. She's saying, okay, if you're Muslim, why do you have to take the responsibility of, shaking someone's hand and telling that you're Muslim? And, well, I have to say is that you have freedom of religion here. So I feel that we should at least have the courtesy to tell people that you're Muslim. Or the courtesy to express that you are Muslim and maybe you want other people to be, I don't know, if you want to be Muslim or whatever. But just even the common courtesy of saying, oh, okay, well, I might not get along with you, but this is probably the reason why, if someone asked. Does anybody know what I'm saying?
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Could you put it? It's a question, exactly.
Oh, it's a question.
Okay, no question there. Maybe over here, and then that'll be our third. Thank you.
I really don't need a mic. If you want to get... First of all, I want to say thank you very much for this panel and for the conversation that happened. I'm originally from the States, and I am Jewish. And one of the things that I have often found lacking in the conversations is just an explicit relationship of the role of power. And that's actually something I heard alluded to a bit, but not actually articulated, which is the role of power both on a personal level, but also the role of power in terms of states and the role of power in terms of discourse. And and I think this was discussed a bit in terms of racialization, but I'd also say that power changes depending on various situations that you're in. And with power and with the feeling that somehow you're going to lose power comes the feeling of fear. And I think that's where you have the issue of the phobia of Islamophobia. And I'm wondering, what is the fear factor that's going on, where we're now turning and looking and fearing that which we've labeled as the other?
Daniel.
I don't know, is this on? Yeah, it's on. Yeah, great question. That's why I tried to invoke Foucault's concept of governmentality, which is a pretty well-known Foucauldian concept of political subjectivity, which looks at the way in which power functions through the creation and the administration of the citizenry vis-a-vis the state. So it's somewhat of a complex procedure. I tried to touch upon it. I'm happy to send you my paper where I go into more detail on it. I did actually my graduate work at American University in Foucauldian governmentality and the ideology of tolerance, looking at how after the Cold War, even pre-9/11, as we see the thinning and the depoliticization of civic spheres in the West, we've also seen tolerance begin to be deployed as a certain state-based sort of strategy for managing extreme cultural differences. And I think that in this context where we have a largely depoliticized civic life, we do find the role of power absolutely fundamentally playing a major role. The linkage from that phenomenon to the generation of fear, that's there. I would say that the real linkage of fear came, and the reason why I argue this homophobia is on the rise is the economic downturn of 2008. I think historically one could make an argument that in times of austerity, we do need a sort of otherization. The society depends upon the ostracization to a certain extent. We've seen this obviously with the rise of fascism in Europe. So those things are definitely happening. And I also think that the fear itself is a very lucrative industry in the West. And one of the things that we need to pay close attention to is the importation of this cottage industry of Islamophobes across the Atlantic into Europe. Because what's happening now in Europe is the diffusion of these ideas into the civil society. In Europe, they do not have the same vibrancy of civil society opportunities that we have, in part because, and I think this is one of the secrets of the US, is that because of our love of religious freedom, we usually approach Islamophobia via the lens of religious difference, and we work through faith-based groups first. They're the first line of defense. If you look at how every single Sharia law bill was put down at the state level, it was through interfaith coalitions. Really, first and foremost, it was the interfaith groups that got together and put an end to it. If you look at how the Florida pastor was taken off of his pedestal, it was interfaith coalitions. So interfaith itself and the challenge of interfaith, the theme of this event, is that we need to be constantly focusing on the real elephants in the room. A lot of my friends that focus on foreign policy, they focus on things like political power. They say, I want to go to an interfaith event, but nobody's talking about Israel and Palestine. They're not talking about the important things. I think we also do need to talk about the important things, right? But we need to temper those and measure those and balance those with the experiential, with the theological, with the poetry, with the music, and so on and so on. But I think there's absolutely a role to talk about the real power dynamics that's going on behind this, because it is a profitable industry. They've profited $53 million, just about a handful of people in the last 11 years at peddling this fear, which has made huge. I mean, the reason why we had Ground Zero mosque controversy, the reason why we had President Obama's a Muslim, these outlandish thing, the Sharia things, I mean, that all comes from this small group of people. So it's very, your point is very well taken. I don't know if anybody else wants to say anything on that.
Thank you, Daniel. You've been in a remarkably attentive and patient audience tonight. On behalf of the panel, I'd like to thank Daniel and Simon Fraser University and the Iona Pacific Center for Interreligious Studies, and thank you all for tonight. Thank you very much.